MKB's in the house. What's up, my man?
There we are. What's going on?
All is good, man. I know this is we thought the Sixers could be getting ready for a Game 4 tonight. That's not happening. It's the Hawks and the Bucks. We'll get into that series in just a minute. But you wrote a little bit about this, and you tweeted this the other day, that don't listen to people that say Ben Simmons has no trade value now or that the Sixers couldn't possibly bring him back next season. Neither of those things are true. Now that we're a week out of this thing, where do we feel, I mean, there's the reports that they met, the two sides. Where do we feel this is more likely headed? Towards a divorce or towards mediation and fixing this thing?
That's obviously the most pressing question facing the team this offseason, Mike. And to me, it could honestly go either way. I think that the two sides met and the no request was made for a trade is, a positive indicator of the fact that, the relationship between the two sides isn't irreparable, that the Sixers would, potentially feel comfortable bringing him back. The situation hasn't reached a breaking point to the point where, they feel as though they need to move on from him. But at the same time, I mean, we know Daryl Morey's track record. We know he's obviously going to do his due diligence and see what opportunities present themselves. And I think there will still be a strong market for Ben, despite his struggles in the postseason, given his age, his accolades, and his ability. So, it's going to be a situation where I think obviously the market is going to dictate what happens. But, to me, it wouldn't be shocking either way, one way or the other.
Of the trades that are kind of being floated out there, do any of them push your pile at all? Do any of them say, if that one's on the table or if this player's on the table, you've got to make that move?
Yeah, I think to me, Mike, and I'm sure a lot of Sixers fans agree with me, it would be a potential trade for Dame Lillard out of Portland. Obviously, that report dropped a couple days ago about him, potentially wanting a separation after some of the blowback from the coaching situation and the team's inability to, build a contender after a bunch of years with him as the primary guy. And to me, that's the type of trade that if you are going to part with Ben Simmons, who was, obviously the top pick in the draft just 5 years ago, runner-up for Defensive Player of the Year, three-time All-Star, a guy that, for all intents and purposes, was meant to be a foundational piece of the Sixers for, the next decade, the foreseeable future. If you are going to move a piece like that, I think you have to get value back, to the extent of a guy like Dame Lillard. I don't think, to me, a package based around draft picks doesn't move the needle. It would have to be a situation where you have a guy like Dame who's basically in his prime right now. He would project to complement really well with Joel on the court. An absolutely elite scorer, the type of guy that in the postseason, when things bog down in the fourth quarter, when the Sixers have had struggles year after year, he's the exact type of guy you can give the ball to on the perimeter and set a screen for, or give him, the ball in isolation and tell him to get you a bucket and he'll deliver. So to me, obviously, if that trade were to present itself, I think the Sixers would have to, capitalize and make a move there. But otherwise, there doesn't, nothing else that I've seen really moves the needle for me, yet. But obviously, we've seen in the NBA that could change.
Yeah, I know.
Pretty quickly.
Yeah, I know Minnesota seems to be interested. D'Angelo Russell's a name. Does he do anything? Does a Ben Simmons, D'Angelo Russell swap make this team better or just different?
I would say worse, in my opinion. I think that would make the Sixers infinitely worse. I think what Ben brings to the court, D'Angelo Russell obviously has developed into a nice player on the offensive end. He's a solid scorer. But if you lose what Ben provides on the defensive end and what he provides offensively in terms of playmaking, rebounding, things like that, and you just replace it with a guy like D'Angelo Russell, who's capable of scoring, but he's not the most efficient player. He's a high-volume scorer. To me, it's just a situation where that you're not getting equal value back for Ben Simmons in that situation.
C.J. McCollum's a name that keeps coming up. You mentioned Dame, but what if they say, I don't want to give you Dame, we'll give you C.J. McCollum? Better, different, worse?
Yeah, that's another one, Mike. I think they would be worse off. I love C.J. McCollum as a player, and if the Sixers could somehow, get him onto the roster alongside Joel and Ben, that's a completely different story, because I think he would almost be the perfect type of third guy between those three players that you can, rely on for, the perimeter scoring and the shot creation. And then, Ben could pick up where he lacks defensively. But if we're talking about trading Ben Simmons, again, C.J. McCollum is another guy, really nice player. But I think if you replace Ben with him on the Sixers, he just doesn't bring everything, especially on the defensive end, obviously, that Ben brings to the floor. And I think ultimately the team would end up being, worse off in a trade like that.
Yeah, I know that there's other, people keep throwing. But it seems that there are teams that are interested, right? It does seem that the Minnesota, they want him quote unquote badly. There's other teams that seemingly, so it appears if the Sixers are motivated to move Ben, they could find a dance partner here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that, Mike. But I don't think it's a situation where, and this is where I think Daryl Morey's experience really comes in handy. I don't think it's a situation where the Sixers should be looking to move him just for the sake of moving him. Like there's definitely interested parties. You mentioned the Timberwolves. Obviously, there's been speculation that the Warriors might be interested. The Sacramento Kings are another team. Potentially even the Thunder. There's a lot of teams that would definitely be interested. But to me, you have a unique situation in the Sixers where you have the runner-up for the MVP in Joel Embiid, basically probably coming into his prime as a player right now. And it's not a couple of years ago to me for the Sixers where they would, potentially want to make a move to get future assets or future draft picks back for Ben Simmons. Like he's a guy that has contributed to winning in the short term for Philadelphia, albeit he's obviously had his struggles in the past postseason, but he's a big part of the reason that they've been successful. And if you're taking him off that roster, I think you really need to get players back that can help you win, in the window that's basically open because of Embiid, guys that can help you win right now. And there's not, a ton of potential suitors I see that have that type of package. So to me, it's a situation where, if the Dame trade happens, if Bradley Beal decides this offseason that he's looking for a new home, maybe you go in that direction. But otherwise, I think it's a situation where if something is great, you do it. But if not, you show patience and you can bring him back next season.
Michael Kaskey-Blomain covers the NBA, the Sixers for CBS Sports. Him not playing in the Olympics, is that a positive sign or a negative sign?
I think you could look at it either way, Mike. I think we touched on this a little bit last week. I think it could potentially have been beneficial for him to play and get that experience on a team where, they have all their ball handlers. They probably play in a more free-flowing style where he would be, the guys setting more screens, playing off the ball a little bit. But at the same time, I think for his image, for his reputation, I think putting the message out there that he's dedicated to, not playing in the Olympics and instead is going to spend that time improving, we assume his shooting mainly in other areas of his game after, what was obviously an embarrassing performance for him. I think that sends a strong message to the Sixers and to potentially other teams that, he obviously knows there's weaknesses in his game for as good as he's been and as much as he's accomplished, and he's willing to, put in the work to improve that. Obviously, only time will tell if that work shows up on the court next season and beyond. But I think you could look at it in a positive way that he's, at least aware that he has these shortcomings and he needs to address, and he's saying that he's going to be willing to put in the work over the offseason.
You wrote an article about something Kobe Bryant said to Ben Simmons, and that he has yet to take that advice. What was the advice, and could it still be something that Ben could learn from?
Yeah, Mike, I thought it was really interesting when I saw that quote pop up after the Sixers were eliminated, because it's obviously not advice that, all of us have been shouting at Ben for a few years now, which is to expand his game and to develop a jump shot, because that will take his game to the next level. But I thought coming from Kobe's perspective was especially unique. It's one thing for you or I or a fan to say that to him, but Kobe was approaching it from the perspective of like, listen, you're already this great, and you don't want to have regrets when your career's over about, what could I have done to potentially, have been even better, to take my team even to further heights than I was able to do that. Coming from a player as revered and as well respected and as successful as Kobe was, obviously, I thought that was, a pretty unique message and a different way to approach it. Instead of just saying like, hey, go improve your game, he was saying like, hey, man, like, it might not seem like a big deal to you now because you're still having all this success. You're making all-star teams. You're, defensive player of the year candidate and whatnot, even without this part of your game. But in 10, 15 years, when you're hanging it up, you don't want to be sitting there and being like, man, if I had done that, maybe the Sixers could have won more titles and I would have been a big part of that. So, I just thought that was unique. And obviously, it's definitely not too late for him to do that, Mike. We have, as we've said multiple times, the dude, he's still only 24 years old. He can shoot. You've been there, obviously, at Wells Fargo and watched him warm up for games. You can see that he can physically shoot foul shots. He can shoot three-pointers. It's just so much of a mental thing to me for him at this point. And I think that, it can be corrected. And I think Kobe was right that if he doesn't at least try to, it's one thing to go out there and shoot and miss like we've seen Giannis do in Milwaukee, things like that. But at the end of the day, he can say, at least I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to expand my game. I think if Ben doesn't doesn't at least try to do that out on the court, then like Kobe said, he probably will end up with regrets when it's all said and done.
What is really the off-season regiment that you would feel comfortable with for him? Like, if I'm the Eagles, I want him to follow what I want him to do, not what he's done in the past. I don't want him working with his brother. I don't want him going to L.A. I don't want him to go here. I want him working under my supervision so that I know I can watch with my own two eyes what he's doing. And then if he's here and he doesn't do that in games, then I know I failed. Whereas if I can't be there with him, I can't supervise what he's doing. So what would you like to see his offseason consist of?
Yeah, I completely agree with you there, Mike. I think in the past, the team has obviously been very lenient with him and his approach. Like you alluded to, he's worked with his brother, his family members to improve his shooting. And at this point, the Sixers are obviously at an inflection point. You know, potentially they trade him. If they do keep him, they're obviously going to need and expect more from him on the offensive end, and especially in terms of his shot. And to me, if I'm the Sixers at this point, I obviously he's a lot free to do and, go as he pleases. And I would let him go to California for, periods of time. But I would also want him, like you said, in Camden, in their own gym, with their own coaches, working on his shot and seeing, charting the improvement over the course of the offseason themselves. I don't know the exact percentage split, maybe something like 70-30, time spent in Philly compared to elsewhere for Ben this offseason. But, I agree with the sentiment that you were saying that he needs to be, not only in Philadelphia, but he needs to be with the Sixers coaches, Doc, the assistants, the shooting coaches. It's going to be a full team effort this offseason to get him, basically to get his confidence back up and improve his game. It's going to be a twofold process, and it's kind of a all hands on deck situation. So I agree he should be spending a bulk of his time of this offseason in Philadelphia working on that game.
MKB at the real Mike KB on Twitter tonight. You got Hawks and Bucks. The Hawks win that first one. They steal one on the road. This feels like the way we thought the Sixers series was going to go. They stole that one on the road, and now the Bucks have wrestled control. Do they let it go, or do you think the Bucks finally close this thing out with a win tonight and then again on Thursday night?
Yeah, like you said, this kind of mirrored the Sixers series early on, Mike. But unlike the Sixers, I think the Bucks are going to prove to just be too much for Atlanta to handle. I think obviously Giannis has been virtually unstoppable, and he's getting help from Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday in a big way. And the Hawks, as they've been this entire postseason, they're so dependent on Trae Young. On the offensive end, they really don't have secondary creators. That they have good shooters and good guys around Trae, but not other guys that can really light it up for you and get you a lot of points. And now Trae's obviously dealing with an ankle injury after twisting it on a referee in that last game. So to me, I think the Bucks kind of found the blueprint. They've done a decent job of limiting him and stopping the others around him from being too impactful. So I think this one is probably going to end up being a gentleman's sweep.
And in the West, we see L.A. get back into it. They're down 3-1. They make it 3-2. What an effort last night from Paul George, a guy who's been questioned a lot. And quite frankly, I'd like to get, Ty Lue's role in this series, because I feel like NBA coaching is one of those things you either, think it's a big portion or you don't. I see him criticized. I see people think he doesn't know what he's doing. I see other people that think he's the difference in this series. You had people criticizing Doc Rivers when they were up 3-1 for not fighting. Now he's getting credit for having him fight. So I feel like this whole Clippers thing has really become an interesting storyline.
Yeah, it absolutely has. And to me, the most impressive thing, Mike, is that they've been doing this, now stretching over two series without their best player in Kawhi Leonard, obviously, who hasn't been playing. They were able to close out and win the last two games against Utah without him. Now they're, in this series 3-2 to potentially go to the finals without him. And, on paper, I expected the Suns to close it out last night, but the Clippers have just proven to be one of those teams this postseason that you just can't count out. They keep getting, contributions. Last night, DeMarcus Cousins came in and gave them 15 points off the bench after, barely playing in much of the postseason. Reggie Jackson has been, unbelievable for them. Marcus Morris. So they're a team that just keeps getting contributions. And I do think a lot of that credit has to go to Ty Lue. He just seems to be pressing the right buttons. Like he makes the adjustments at the right time. He started man some games. He started Zubac some games. He was, making consistent adjustments to his rotation. And, so far they seem to pay off. Obviously it'll be tough for them to win two more straight without, probably without Kawhi against this Suns team. But at this point, I wouldn't count them out.
Did the Sixers hire the wrong Clippers coach?
That's a good question, Mike, and I think it's definitely fair because they're almost opposites at this point. Where Doc has been being criticized for being a little bit too, set in his ways, a little bit stubborn, a little slow to adjust. Ty Lue is becoming, really lauded and applauded for being very quick on the trigger to make adjustments and swing a series like that. So, I think it's a little too early to say that. I'm willing to give the Doc the, somewhat of a benefit of the doubt with his first season with the Sixers. I thought they obviously had a great regular season. They came up short in the postseason. But it's a fair argument to make it the way things are shaking out for sure.
All right, last one for MKB. More likely to happen, Ben Simmons here, Ben Simmons gone, or Tobias Harris traded?
That's a great question, Mike, and I think that's a little sneaky thing that a lot of Sixers fans aren't necessarily considering because all the attention's been on Ben Simmons. But I think there's ways to improve this team. As great as Tobias has been, if he's a guy that you could trade to get some dynamic guard play while also keeping, the two younger and better players in Ben and Joel, I think that's a route that the Sixers would have to consider. I think it's probably a little bit more likely to rank those three things. I think the most likely is that Ben will be back. Second is that he'd be traded. And the third, that Tobias would be traded. But I think the possibility that Tobias is the one traded is a little bit higher than, has really been discussed so far, at least.
All right, a crazy offseason will begin here shortly after the NBA Finals. We will certainly be into that, the draft, and much more with Michael Kaskey-Blomain, NBA writer from CBS Sports, at The Real Mike KB on Twitter. And, of course, he appeared here on the Sports Bash. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Mike. Happy 4th.
You do the same, man. Happy 4th of July. It is 4th of July weekend, by the way.